So welcome everyone to this session on speed to access, adaptive and accelerated R&D. My name's Sheuli Porkess. I'm the Director of Research, Medical and Innovation at ABPI, and it's my absolute pleasure to be facilitating this session this afternoon. What I'd like to do to start with is to ask my colleagues on the panel to introduce themselves, and then we'll get into talking about the meat of the topic. So perhaps Leeza, if you'd like to introduce.
Good afternoon, I'm Leeza Osipenko. I work at NICE. I've been at NICE for 5 years. I had scientific advice at NICE, where we advise companies at the development stage of their products, not just pharmaceuticals, but devices and diagnostics as well, and we're hoping to see some vaccines in the future. We work very closely with the European Medicines Agency, giving advice in parallel and watching where the hell are they going to go next week. Yeah. So how far would we have to fly? We do work with MHRA closely as well on joint advice, and believe it or not, with the FDA as well, but on devices only. So very busy landscape. We at NICE participated in all of the adaptive pathway pilots, so I can show you some information on that. And yeah, so that's what I do.
Thanks. So I am the head of global clinical development and medical affairs at UCB, which is my sort of day job. I have a couple of other hats I wear just to disclose, which might seem like either conflicts of interest, I'm not sure, or at least you should be aware of them. So I'm also a board member of the Human Tissue Authority, so I play a regulatory role there as well. And was also champion for one of the work streams, work stream 1, which was about establishing need and looking for pathways as part of the accelerated access review, and was pleased to see the accelerated access collaborative come through as an idea which we had championed as part of that. And again, interested we can have the conversation about that as we move through the session, but I think the devil will be in the detail about how we make it work, but happy to go through that.
Hello, my name is Piers and I'm the Director of Global Alliances for a US cancer charity that specialises in real-world data and effectively how you use that to drive an evidence base starting off in off-label in less common indications through to how you use real-world data to deliver all the adaptive stuff. So I'm more at the implementation side of this. Previous life, I was the Interim Global Director for commercial launch on ponatinib at Pharmaceuticals, and I took 18 months off time to market using special license sales and other forms of adaptive technique.
Thank you. And Jackie.
Hello, I'm Jackie Carmel. So I have been at Genentech actually for, I was an employee of Genentech from 2008 as the oncology strategic lead for clinical development. So I worked in clinical development for over 25 years. The company got bought by Roche, and I converted to consultant to actually continue working for Genentech, and have recently just moved my contract over to Roche. What I do there is still work across Genentech Roche to enable their cancer immunotherapy portfolio to be accelerated, and have pulled together an academic industry network called IMCOR, which is a collaboration between 25 academic centres around the world to accelerate cancer immunotherapy by collaboration. So my focus has been very much on the acceleration of clinical development.
Great, thank you very much. And I guess maybe to start us on this topic, maybe if I could ask each of you to say, why is it that we're interested in this topic? What could it look like? What could adaptive and accelerated R&D look like? And what would the benefits be? So maybe Leeza, if you want to.
You sure you want to start with me? Okay. So we see the final result. So I guess for industry might be one answer. For us, it's the other answer. What we want to see in the end is a good quality product that minimizes risks to patients and provides good value for money for the healthcare system. It's an extremely, extremely challenging task. And the more we play with how we develop the drugs, the tighter we make the timelines, the more we change the pathways, the more we cut corners, the more risk we bring into this final equation. It doesn't mean that we should always stick with where we've been. It's an evolving science, and there are ways of definitely, I think drug development is awfully inefficient, and there's a lot of ways to improve. But we need to do it very smartly, and we need to always keep in mind that the final objective is not how fast you can bring something to market and what your shareholder value will look like, but how safe is your product and what value you're bringing to your patients, because in the end, all of you are patients. The fact that you're bringing this product for someone else doesn't mean your nephew or your some long-distance relative might not use it, and you bring a lot of risk if you don't account for it. So we need to make sure we're responsible for that risk, and we need to make sure we deal with that, and we have structures in place to deal with it during the development process and after the development process. Once again, I'm not saying I'm not pro faster ways to market. I'm not saying that I'm not pro collaboration and transparency. There are a lot of steps that we can make, but hopefully we can discuss it through this panel today.
And Stuart, for you, what is it?
Well, I think the reason why we're here is, as Leeza said, it's all about patients, but why has this become an issue? And the reason from my perspective it's become an issue is because the model we have is broken. We cannot continue to go through a broken RCT model as the sole route to getting medicines to patients. And the reason we have a model which is as extensive and as risk-averse as it is for, as Leeza mentioned, all of those safety issues which are late or post-approval safety issues that we've seen in what have otherwise been well-established medicines. So not only is the RCT model broken from my perspective, from a time perspective, also from a utility perspective, from being able to generate data which is relevant and valid. So all of that then drives us to say, well, the reason we have that is based on risk, patient risk. And so we need to be able to not only accelerate to get medicines in the hands of patients more quickly, but to offset that risk. So we cannot just bring the milestone forwards. We have to find something which offsets risk and allows us to incrementally expose and test and incrementally expose and test in a way which satisfies patient need, but also provides the ability to gain further return on investment, but also to kill things more quickly if they're not going forward sufficiently. So that to me is the driver.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I know fundamentally if you look at what we're doing, we overpower trials on efficacy and we underpower them on adverse event prediction or spotting. And what all these systems do is end up with you get to market faster on efficacy and you do on market adverse event spotting, normally in real world data. What that does is, yes, three things. Number one, good stuff gets to market faster. In patient groups which are relatively small and hard to recruit and which are chandlerly uneconomic for current RCTs, good stuff actually just gets there. And as importantly, legacy stuff gets switched off when it's proven to be low utility. And I think that's the quid pro quo that pharma has to be comfortable with a move to real-world data and adaptive licensing is, yes, your cost to get to market will come down, but you can't guarantee you're going to get that full patent life because there's other stuff coming down and it might get switched off.
Thank you. And then Jackie.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, working in oncology, and I've heard several speakers over the last couple of days also working in immuno-oncology, which is one of those spaces where we've got so many different options, so many different combinations, which is where we're going, and there is the idea of cure is there, and so how do we test these combinations in a safe way, in a way that we can do it to get more patients exposed, but in a safe way with the answers, with all the different variables. I mean, there are thousands of combinations we could be looking at. We need to be looking at adaptive designs. We need to be working with the regulators, which is happening, I might add. I think almost every regulatory agency that we've been working with the adaptive designs of the cancer immunotherapy trials have been very open to these discussions. But I completely agree with what's been said, the safety of what we're doing and exposing these patients. And in this space, we don't have good animal models either. So we have that added risk as we're going into this multi-combination field in a very, very competitive environment.
Thank you. So maybe sticking with you, Jackie, what do you see, you mentioned a number of things there. What if you had to say what the main challenge was, what do you think you'd...
Right now, the main challenge from getting these trials done is numbers of patients. That is, there are 50 PD-1, PD-L1 checkpoint inhibitors out there, and that's just the backbone of where the combinations are starting. When you start looking at the number of molecules that are being looked at in this field, and they are being researched, and they are in clinic, just getting the studies done fundamentally is a problem. The other problem that I see, certainly with the work that I'm doing with working with this industry academic alliance, which for me is where it has to go. No one group has the answer. The answers have to be done in collaboration. And one of the hurdles, maybe I should have been in the last session, but one of the hurdles that I'm finding is data sharing. Now it is on a more transactional level. We are talking study level, but I'm finding data sharing between the academic institutions and industry as being very difficult to overcome.
Piers, do you want to comment on that?
Yes, I think it's very true. I think we have to realise that everyone wants their little silos, and unless we change those incentives, they're going to continue. We should be explicit about what they are. Academics love keeping control of their data because they can remine it for the rest of time or for citations, and unless the funders change that, they're going to keep those behaviours. Pharma is always worried about in its data whether or not there's another Vioxx lurking there, even if they think it's okay. And until basically someone smashes heads together and says, the deal is you both go fully transparent, and puts an incentive in there, and a hard incentive, not nice words, the problem's going to continue. You never do this.
So just sticking with that, are we getting it right anywhere? Are there any... or nearly right? Maybe?
Nearly right. So it depends on what you mean by that. So, and also, first of all, we, UK, we the world.
The world.
I think the Yoda Consortium's getting pretty close to relatively slow clinical trial transparency in that consortium, and there's a lot to be said for the way the Wellcome Trust is providing the guardianship for that. I think there's a lot of the stuff that's going on in the US, mainly led out of UCSF personnel on the last president's initiative around clinical trial sharing, which is kind of getting to the point where they are going to start holding feet to the fire. And basically, you're going to get the clinicians, academic clinicians, to change behaviour until you tell them they're not going to get another clinical trial funded until they've been transparent on the ones that have gone before. And until someone does that, the answer to your question is no.
Okay. Thank you. Maybe moving on to risk, because both Stuart and Leeza, you both mentioned risk. Stuart, would you like to elaborate a bit on the theme of risk?
Yeah, in fact, I was going to say, if you had asked me what the primary challenge was, I would have said risk, actually. But actually, it's risk aversion,
yes.
I see as the biggest issue. And I think it goes in two ways. One of which is that we all, and I think all of us from the various members of the companies, the regulators to an extent as well, are risk averse to try something we don't know. So we know what the risk is in our randomised studies and our portfolios, but actually coming to a less quantifiable risk, or at least one we believe is less quantifiable, is one I think that we have to embrace and think about a different way forwards. I'd like to just remind people what Ian Hudson said yesterday, is that the best thing that you can do is ask for advice and then follow it, which I think is good advice in and of itself. But also I think, my interactions with MHRA, EMA, FDA, is when you have an open conversation with them about what the options are going forward, they are incredibly helpful and flexible. Whereas when I've been in other meetings with them, when we have gone to ask them a question for them to validate what our preconceived idea is, that is not necessarily the way forward. So I think that's one side of the risk piece, and if you can indulge me for the other side of the risk piece for a moment. The other piece, I think, then is the corollary about how we manage the commercial arrangements going forwards. And I think we often kid ourselves as to what is value versus willingness to pay. And new commercial models, either through backloaded payments, flexible discounts, etc., however you want to do it, have to reflect an accruing evidence base rather than the aspirational price of the sponsor.
Great, thank you. And then, Leeza, what would you say is the key, the main challenge from your perspective?
Well, I'll continue the topic from the idea of risk, because obviously if products arrive to us with less data or with suboptimal data quality, it's a bigger risk for the committee to make a decision. There is more uncertainty, and there is the need for new tools to be in place to manage that risk. And as Stuart just mentioned, we need to have the kind of dialogues which are open and at the right time, because companies come to us also with locked phase 3 trials for very unpleasant dialogues, and at least they have a chance to still ask about economic modeling, but it's not about statistical manipulations of trying to figure out how you can get a yes from the decision maker. You're to answer to the patients who need to benefit from your product, not from the regulator who on a borderline you pass the threshold for a yes decision. So the point is to figure out how to have this open dialogue early on, and we never tell the companies do this or do that, but we always give options, and we know that companies have to talk to FDA and EMA, and we know regulatory requirements. And the whole idea is to figure out how early on can you manage, can you move, whether it's an adaptive design. Sometimes adaptive designs are great, sometimes they're not. Sometimes you really need to have a very clear evidence against an active comparator, because an active comparator is there and you have no right to not do it. You can easily recruit a proper randomized trial, and you're cutting corners, and we see that. And but there are situations where single-arm trials is the only way forward, and we're completely aware of that, and no one is trying to fit your development plans into one regulatory scope that you must follow. So it is a very bespoke method, and I think what's happening sometimes, these new steps that are currently being offered to speed up access, to speed up drug development, are being applied incorrectly to products where they shouldn't be applied. So that's something also to keep in mind. So we need to celebrate and help the companies where we can to speed things up and prevent cutting corners from the situations where we should do much better science. So yeah, but from our point of view, actual risk is that we start seeing a lot more products coming to NICE with conditional approvals, with single-arm trials only on phase 2 data. We still look at these drugs. Believe it or not, we say yes in many more cases than we say no, but we're working very hard on figuring out how to develop managed access agreements. We have a cancer drugs fund for oncology products, which gives us 2-year time lag to generate more evidence, and we're almost finishing the paper, which is analyzing, it should be published quite soon, it's analyzing all the NICE decisions for the drugs that received conditional licensing from the EMA, and you will find answers surprising, hopefully positive. So.
Thank you. So far we've heard that this is about keeping the patient in view, mean that we need to be adaptive and evolve because the current ways of working don't necessarily work. Keywords we've heard have been around collaboration and risk and open dialogue. At this stage, I'd just like to see, is anyone in the audience got a question, something, a comment? No? Okay. So maybe, Piers, you mentioned at the beginning this was about implementation. If you were thinking about what needs to be done, where would you start?
Well, for me at the moment, my two focuses, I'd separate it out between two areas. There's the first indication adaptive stuff, and there are better experts to talk about it on this panel than me. Where we focus mostly is on second indication and on effectively adaptive reimbursement. And for those, there are actually quite good ways. This is actually one of the best countries in the world to do it, which is why an American charity has someone who speaks with an accent like me. Because actually, formally, the data sets already exist. Just that we, for things to do with the previous session, can't get our hands on them. So, There is a national cancer registry here that has every regimen. It is perfectly possible where things are close to equipoise, for instance, the VEGF inhibitors in renal cancer are all within margin of error of one another, to design randomising real-world studies that are entirely using the existing data sets. And they will produce huge amounts of information that will probably allow us to work out which patient subgroups those drugs should be used on. We're not doing it, and we're not doing it entirely for data privacy reasons, and the barriers I mentioned earlier, which is academics don't want other people looking at their data. There are at least 3 ways to get the data necessary to do those studies in the UK. If you're going across to Europe, there's at least another 5 to 7 countries that are about the same technological development, but they don't have our scale. We've got a window of opportunity. Question whether or not we stake it. So one of the reasons I'm here is I think that data needs busting out for patient benefit, and I'm hoping there's people in the room who might want to do that for their own personal benefit, as it were. Because it's perfectly possible from an IT point of view to do that now.
Okay.
Just lack of will.
So you mentioned about second indication, maybe thinking about the first indication then, so when something's going for a first indication, what could be done there? And maybe Jackie, if you want to share some thoughts around collaboration, because that came,
I mean, these days, companies don't have all the technologies they require to actually get all the information on the molecule, first indication, subsequent indications. It is, I think in oncology, many years ago, 20 years ago, I did work in cardiovascular, but I find the oncology field actually is very open to academic industry collaboration over and above any other space I've ever worked in, although it has been oncology for a long time. And I do find actually, slightly contrary to what Piers was saying, I had in a room quite recently, a couple of weeks ago, 250 immunotherapy experts in clinicians, physicians, as well as scientists, translational scientists, biomathematicians, etc. And actually, and we made them, we put the elephant in the room. We had a data sharing debate, and we said, let's talk about this, because this is becoming an issue, and if we're going to move this ahead, advance and accelerate cancer immunotherapy together, we've got to get this elephant done. And in fact, there was a huge willingness from. Now, maybe they were saying it because we wanted to hear it, and maybe the naysayers were quiet. But what we've found is that in fact, they seem to be very open to the data sharing, but it's when we actually get down to...
It's delivering.
It's delivering, and it's the universities.
Exactly, I agree with this.
It's the universities who have not quite got the understanding that this isn't Roche Genentech owning everything at all. We're opening as well. This is all of you collaborating with each other. And getting the universities to try to understand that is just...
There's a real... And also actually, for instance, the assets that we work with are actually real-world assets inside the NHS. And there the data governance processes are even more risk-averse. I agree. There's a need for a trusted third-party type discussion about how this is done, because it's about, and that brings in the data governors and probably the TTOs, because I think there's value in their data when they get in the way. I agree, and I think there are clinical communities that will move fast, but also ones that won't.
Yeah, I'm sure if we lifted ourselves out of the process completely, maybe it would be better. But
I don't think there's any need to, because as you said, all those products. The search space is the complexity of cancer with the complexity of combinations.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, my last looking at it, there were 1,200 compounds on market or in clinical trial. I don't know what 1,200 squared is, but it's a pretty big number.
It's a big number. Back to my original point about patient. The patients at the end of this, the patients getting access to the trials, and the patient competition to do the trials.
Yeah. And how we search that space does need rethinking, and I think it has to be on the front of the dialogue for the entire community for how we do that, and what we do differently to make that happen.
Can I ask a question based on, I don't mean to take over but based on what you were saying about looking at VEGF inhibitors, and we've got data there, we just can't access it. The first thing that sprung to my mind is, but hang on, we haven't got consent of the patient, and actually the NHS doesn't own the data, or does the NHS?
Well,
Who owns that data?
So that data, well, formally that data is owned by the Secretary of State for Health.
Okay.
But the controllership is complex because it is originally generated in the hospitals, so there's a bunch of sets there. So you can actually put it out, for instance, if you partner with, there's at least 3 chemotherapy companies that have 30% market share. And they've got actually all the dosing information, for instance, you can put it out via that. They then escalated up to the cancer registry, which is inside Public Health England. And Public Health England is just basically a closed door, just very risk adverse and very on this stuff. So it depends on what you mean. There's different ways you could attack that problem. You could also attack it if you wanted, because most of the time the signal's survival, if you just linked up the death certificates with the specialty commissioning top-up flows that happen inside the NHS. So we think there's at least 4 IT solutions that can get you there, just to give you a sense. And then coming back to where you're going, which is the privacy solution, everyone consents the way forward. But these aren't necessarily active trials. I'm not exposing anyone to risk. You can use what's called statistical anonymization, which I use the following example. My son is 8. He's at a school, and there's a Chinese clothing manufacturer that needs to know the inside legs of 8-year-olds to sell them nice blue tracksuit bottoms. You can either go and get 38-year-olds and measure their inside legs, that's personal data, or you can ask the school for the average and the standard deviation. Actually, what do we put in our scientific papers? The cohort statistics. Yeah. They are all anonymous statistics. Folk like me are quite capable of building you IT systems that mean you never need to look at that pseudonymized data again, if you wish. And so for real-world data where the consent problem becomes an issue, actually what we need is modern IT solutions that recognize that actually what researchers work with is qualified data and statistics, and that bypasses most of privacy.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience or thoughts? Yeah, please. Would you like to say your name and...
I mentioned yesterday that the Cancer Moonshot in America has as one of its objectives big data sharing. I think 5 or 6 companies have already signed up to that. So is that going to help, or is it going to be bureaucratized to the front or all that sort of stuff?
Can I take that? Well, because to be honest, what we set up IMCOR was based on Vice President Biden's call for Moonshot. And Genentech is one of the companies who signed up to Moonshot. And for those of you who may not be au fait with Moonshot, essentially what the Vice President Biden said is, what we need to do is do 10 years worth of research, bring it in 5 years. And the call was to academics, and originally the call was actually to academics, and then industry got brought in slightly behind because realised that was a bit of a problem to leave out industry where the molecules are. So industry then got brought in quite quickly. And it certainly had a slow start. There was a lot of talk and a lot of different streams and a lot of effort and a lot of talk. My understanding is that actually this year we are starting to see some progress, some bigger data sharing. I know that the certain companies are now beginning to work more together, certainly under Moonshot. I know with IMCOR, we've actually had companies come to us and say, can we actually be part of IMCOR? And that's a great discussion because that's where we should be going, actually. And this has all been under the Moonshot sort of umbrella as such. So yes, I think it looked like it was going down the wrong path. It looked like it was going into a whole of bureaucracy, but my understanding is there are some threads that are coming out now that are likely to yield some good results.
But if we can do it for that, maybe we can do it in COPD and asthma and
Yes, and what this country got that America doesn't, really strong disease charities. So if you want a trusted third party to adjudicate on these stuff that is deeply expert, this country is differentiated. Okay. And it's just a question of unfortunately they're mostly quite basic research and where they focus. But no, I noticed that the BHF has just appointed a data scientist as its chairman. Go figure.
I think you're right. The ability, as Trevor was saying, to be able to pool data and make faster decisions. I think the analogy, the best one I can think of, is either like the Moonshot or something like I Spy, the NIH study in breast cancer, where the basket type design of validating interventions and then throwing them out if they don't prove that they've got that ability to differentiate and have a benefit, allows decisions to be made much more quickly. And whether we do that through charities, whether we do it through access to NHS data, I think there is a real opportunity there. And again, that allows us to make risk decisions much more quickly, particularly about killing assets which are not going to be viable.
Great, thank you. Any other comments from the audience or questions? No? Leeza, you talked about the risks of having the wrong molecules getting through quickly. Would you like to elaborate on that and what that means? So you said for the right products and...
I'm not sure there's such thing as a wrong molecule. Well, I guess there is a risk of products about which we know little about getting through. I mean, sorry, I have to rephrase your question, otherwise I'll say something wrong. So, in terms of faster access through reimbursement, there are, in my mind, there are, let's say, two types of products. There are more conventional things for more conventional diseases that we know about. We know a lot about diabetes. We know a lot about cardiovascular disease. We know a lot about oncology. Yes, there's problems of accessing data, but there's a lot of stuff out there. There are a lot of comparative treatments. And there is another world, let's say, of very orphan products where we know nothing about. There are no treatments. There are no cures. There is nothing out there. There's no comparator. And there's this in-between situation when it's curative proposition to an old problem. So we might know a lot about oncology, and someone comes over with CAR T cell and says, we'll cure you, it'll be a complete response. So basically, okay, there are three groups. And what happens is when we deal with, and currently there is this big push that we had 10 years ago, it wasn't there. We didn't see those products coming through NICE. There were no suggestions for cures. Hep C obviously presented a new interesting challenge across the world, but the very few, let's say, excitements, there's a lot of incremental innovation, which we still need. I'm not against it, but there were very few things which disrupt the system. Now, more and more, especially with highly specialized technologies for ultra-orphan conditions, we start seeing very disruptive innovation. They come through cell and gene therapies, they come through enzyme treatments, they come through RNA modes of actions. There are different modes of actions that companies are exploring which haven't been tried before. This is a risk. We're all excited about that. We do want them to get to patients as soon as possible. The problem is, we don't know what's tomorrow. We know that the trials showed like that, but we don't know whether that cell and gene or gene therapy will actually cure someone, or 2 years from now somebody will drop dead or something will go wrong with future generations. We just don't know, and we have to take that risk. We can't just keep telling people run 50-year trials. So we're very open to it, and we welcome all these therapies, and we have methods to appraise them. I think what my message is to say that the industry should not look at all the, let's say, green lights that we're giving to these innovative products because this is a chance, this is a cure, this is let us try because there's no other option. Let's all of a sudden start applying it to the most mundane conditions that we're dealing with every day. And for the industry, of course, it's uber attractive because you have thousands and thousands, you have millions of cardiovascular patients, you have millions of Alzheimer's patients, you have millions of oncology patients. It's super attractive to apply all those new things to other areas where I'm not sure we necessarily can afford to take those risks. Sometimes we can, or sometimes we cannot. We need to be very diligent and very clear on the steps that we're making, because the price tag that comes with them is, it can bankrupt healthcare systems. So we need to be very mindful, because if somebody offers a miracle, the system will pay for it. We do want to bring that to patients. It can be expensive. NICE is not saying if something is expensive, we're not going to reimburse it and everything needs to be cheap. If eculizumab delivers over 10 QALYs, that's an amazing result. No oncology treatment will ever deliver you that. They deliver 0.2, 0.4. So yes, eculizumab was expensive, and yes, it was approved. So, and it depends on where we are. And when we have incremental innovation, once again, it has to be there, it has to be reasonably priced, it has to be given access to people, it has to be openly shared, because we need to know this data, what works, what doesn't work, so other researchers can build on it and innovate further and further and further. Because with incremental innovation, without those miracle treatments, we've made massive steps in cancer, in overall survival. So we can't necessarily say that we'll celebrate only like cool stuff. So, but there needs to be a very clear judgment in approach of what is accelerated and what is carefully managed. And I really think what you've been talking about in terms of transparency, data sharing, this is massively needed for mainstream diseases, because what we see through scientific advice, the amount of mistakes and repetition is just mind-boggling. It's completely confidential. I can't tell you what companies bring to us, but oh my God, they all do the same thing with all the same stuff. And then you sit there and think, why can't you just get in one room, make all mistakes together, get out, and then do some after you realize that, and then go and do the right thing. So, but because of this patents, because of the lack of transparency, because of rush to market, because of competition, we're very much lagging behind, and it's disappointing. So, and that's, you don't see that in ultra-orphan space, because very few people ever dare to risk to go into ultra-orphan space. You see that in Alzheimer's disease, you see that in oncology, you see that in diabetes, in cardiovascular, in dermatology, in respiratory diseases. So we need to do some kind of adaptive collaboration, transparency, open trial design to make things a lot more efficient there, rather than on this regulatory approval, or let's approve something on the single arm phase 2 trial. So that's my view on that.
So can I bring Stuart in on this then? I think you mentioned about the accelerated access collaborative, and I think...
Yeah, so I think firstly the collaborative, I think, is one way which some of these early conversations will happen. I think, as Leeza mentioned, it is more likely to be for the orphan or the highest medical need, and they are talking around 5 or 10 products a year. So it's not going to be for everything, and it may or may not be for something like Alzheimer's. It depends upon the level of breakthrough that's there. But if it does, I mean, my hope would be that this would set the framework for a more flexible adoption of different ways of evaluating and accessing medicines, even if the true accelerated pathway as outlined in the review is only limited to those several few. The other thing which I think is probably worth mentioning, and I take Lisa's point that we will pay for innovation, is that if you read the government's response to the accelerated access review, it is a nil-sum game. Any additional costs have to be paid for out of cost savings elsewhere. And although we've talked about pharma and drugs, the review itself looked at drugs, devices, digital, and diagnostics. And one of the things that we very carefully tried to look at was ways that we could amend or find opportunities for innovations to amend the care pathway to create headroom for innovation. So I think that's an important piece to think about, that if you can keep people out of hospital, if you can use digital devices to measure people's, I don't know, whether it's even as simple as prothrombin, thrombin time and clotting parameters, and close down warfarin clinics. All those sort of things can free up immense headroom, both in terms of resource. So I think, Sheuli, to answer your question, the important piece around that is how do we help create that headroom to allow those innovations to foster? Because we will pay, but we haven't got a bottomless pit.
Piers, did you want to?
Yeah, I just want to sort of pick up on that actually, because there's some very good examples of this. 90% of the cost is in care, the hospital care, the NHS, the people who wear the blue badges. And we don't think enough about switching off cost and legacy systems there. One that I'm particularly passionate about, for instance, is radiotherapy. Old-fashioned linacs are not very good. For instance, there's quite good data that intraoperative radiotherapy in breast cancer is as effective and a lot lower side effect. It's also about tenfold cheaper. In fact, we could switch off 20% of our linacs. We wouldn't have to go to 6-day working. Now, it's a really good example of something, but there's no way at the moment for that innovation to spread through the NHS, because it actually hits a vested interest, which is those people don't want the linac switched off. And we don't talk enough about the fact that if we're going to make this headroom, we actually, come back to what I said at the beginning, what do these things do? They allow the good stuff to get to patients faster. They allow stuff that would never get to patients because it's too hard to find them to get to patients. But they allow us to find what doesn't work and switch it off. And we don't do enough on that. Now, clearly industry has no incentive to do that, but the healthcare system should. And that's where real-world evidence should be at its most powerful. And I would know there's not enough people in the NHS in this room for that, but what works and what doesn't needs to become something that is not defined in randomized controlled trials alone. We continue that process for the complete product cycle. That means beyond the generic event. And we don't do that. But that's how we will pay for it.
Agreed.
Leeza, do you want to comment on that?
I don't think I can comment, because for us it's the way at NICE we're not changing the NHS operational structure or systems.
But you could recommend against things that are legacy in your recommendations.
Absolutely, there are guidelines, and then people like you should be on guideline committees bringing this up to the attention, and I think to an extent they know, but it's still improving productivity of the NHS, or improving healthcare system, and pricing of very expensive medicines is these are two different issues. So
exactly.
You've brought an example of oncology, and you might be completely right, and I completely agree that NHS could have been a bit more productive or more efficient, but so can any other healthcare system, I suppose. But the question is, what are we talking about here? We're talking about making nurses work better. We're talking about how should we develop new drugs. So it's to make them cheaper and to make them more accessible. And these are connected problems, but they might be connected in oncology more than in other conditions where, let's say, hospital burden is not as, let's say, significant. So it could be one-off administration and the person is out of the healthcare.
I would argue it's going to go across it. Let's take the PCSK9s. Again, they're coming with a
Yeah,
challenge.
I mean, obviously there is a connection, and now we can connect it to a complete societal situation. We're all getting older and living longer than 30 years ago, and there's this huge new burden for the world that we haven't known 30 years ago, and new diseases. So we can connect all of that and accumulate the costs. So I think if the point is about adaptive design and speed to market, we should probably focus on that for now.
Okay, any comments or thoughts from the audience? We've heard some quite interesting debates in the last few minutes. And okay, very quiet. So I guess in the
Sheuli, there's a comment.
Oh, apologies. Sorry. Would you like to say who you are and
I'm Lloyd Loeb. I do a lot of work around digital health strategy and some of the reimbursement models that are required for new models of care. Responding to Piers' point about how do payer organizations, the provider organizations like the NHS respond to some of the new therapies and ways of working, it's a tough one, really, isn't it? Because who are the people who adopt this? It'll be usually you have to go and persuade the clinicians in the hospitals that yes, this is a new way of therapy, but you're then damaging their own domain, or which they've ruled for 20, 25 years.
Absolutely.
They're not going to be the ones. It's like turkeys voting for Christmas.
I accept this is a problem, and you know, hand on heart, what do I think you need to do about it? You need to measure the performance of a health service much more effectively than we do. If you look at what goes into a national clinical audit today, it is compliance with guidelines. It's not an outcome.
Yes, but I'm not aware of anyone who's tracking compliance with guidelines. When we tried to do that through another company in primary care, the people who resisted it the most were the GPs. They didn't want anyone looking at how compliant they were with prescribing guidelines or their referral patterns or anything like that.
Absolutely.
So whilst there is all good respect for guidelines, in many respects it's lip service, and
but
no one wants to be audited on that.
Let's give an example. I make it about 30 men in this room. That means 15 of us are going to get prostate cancer, and 7 of us are going to need a full radical vasectomy. In this country, on the single patient reported outcome survey that's been done at national scale, 44% of us, 4 of us, will be rendered incontinent for the rest of our lives. Not in Hamburg, which measures it. It'll be 1. We're not measuring the right things, which is the real world equivalence of clinical trial endpoints inside the healthcare system. Because if you start measuring those on a relatively routine basis, clinicians have enough of a compassion gene and enough of a self-improvement gene to want to get better. Regulators get the data they need to be able to do proper adaptive licensing and spot whether or not it works in the patient groups that weren't properly tested in a randomized drug control environment. And people like me get the data they need to switch off legacy stuff to create the headroom. That's how we solve it. And I accept that is a huge challenge, but Sweden's done it more or less systematically. Wales has committed to doing it systematically. The Netherlands and Belgium have committed to doing it systematically. It's political will.
Thank you. Any comments, questions, please?
Ruth Brown, Reliance Physician. My question is to do with what you were saying earlier about modifications of clinical trials and so on. I wondered whether patients actually have enough information to know what's available and how they can impact accelerated R&D and so on, and how they can get more involved in what they can do to actually get that information out there.
I think that's a great point. The patients don't know enough about clinical trials. In fact, there is technology that is starting to get out there to patients. You know, we go back to the wearables. I mean, I think we could have probably put these 2 panels together. You know, I've recently come in contact with an app for cancer patients that will tell them at what point in their journey that a clinical trial may now be suitable, and if so, looking at the parameters that I've been looking at and your side effects that I've been monitoring with your mobility, etc., I can tell you these are the trials that you may be suitable for. If you just plug in your LFTs, you know, these are the ones, and you know, we can link you to the principal investigator. Here's their contact details if you want. So there are things coming. I agree, this is a big need. As I say, the comforting thing is there is something already out there in America, Canada, and Israel. You know, I've been talking to this company about what to do in this country, but from a cancer patient perspective, that I think it's getting better. It's recognised, it's not out there. The other disease areas, I'm afraid, you know, I can't really talk about. But I agree with you. This is a big problem, and you know, I don't know what the latest data is on the percentage of patients who actually are in clinical trials in our academic institutions or in general hospitals. But I know it's relatively low compared with some other countries.
Higher in oncology, I
Higher
think, in
in
the UK.
Apart from
Yes,
oncology,
yes.
that's what I
In
don't know
England.
the
Yes.
so I don't
In
know
England.
the other disease areas.
But what's really interesting is it's higher in oncology, but it massively over-indexes to academic trials.
Mm.
Yes.
We're under-indexed to the commercial side.
Well, yes,
Absolutely.
and we could talk about that.
So there is a huge need for
It's-
this.
yes.
Technology solutions are there already to do it.
Mm-hmm.
What's needed is business model innovation. So charity groups need to get into bed with technology solution providers so they can link it up, because they all need navigation for this stuff. And someone needs to name and shame. You know, there are large, well-known brand name academic hospitals here which will only allow a patient to know about the trials going on in their institution. In a world of precision medicine, when they've got a small part of the portfolio, that's not ethical.
We have time at the back. Yeah.
I've just got one comment. I've had to clinical research notes at ABPI University Hospital. The level of morale within that clinical unit is at an all-time low because there are not enough clinical nurses to do the work that's actually there. Actually, she was asked to do, targets were excessive. She was asked to complete 11 clinical trials, so she had 11 oncology trials going under her remit alone. The request to actually get patients into those clinical trials were just unrealistic. She would have had to include every single myeloma patient within her yearly workload to get every single one of them on the trial, let alone exclusion criteria.
Yeah.
And there is, we've got to actually appreciate that if we're going to actually ask people to do a lot more work, the workload has to be managed, and there has to be an upskilling of the workforce
Absolutely.
within this field.
Otherwise,
We're never going to achieve it.
So I mean, you know, I work in clinical trials globally, and I actually do not that much in this country. I put my hands up. My role for Genentech was actually to globalize their oncology clinical development from the US. I happen to live in the UK, but that's about it. And what you talk about there is actually one of the fundamental problems, because this is a fantastic country to do clinical trials in. We have fantastic clinicians, there's great technologies, there's so much here. But that is one of the key problems, is the resource, the headcount to actually handle it and manage it. So when you say we have, you know, a high proportion of patients in cancer trials, and you rightly point out they're mainly academic, you know, this is one of the problems, that there's just not enough people to actually serve the trials.
So and I agree, and I think you raise a really useful point. I think it reflects, however, you talked about exclusion criteria, that many of the patients are not suitable for clinical trials because the clinical trials don't, unfortunately, not just in oncology, don't reflect clinical reality. And one of the ambitions that we should have, and I know that Sally Davis talks about this as part of the NIHR, is that every patient should be considered for a clinical trial. If we get the kind of mindset of being able to include patients who are experiencing that kind of real life, it doesn't become a separate activity, it becomes part of their care. And then I think it comes to Piers' point about how we can utilise the data that we have. One of the biggest scandals, if you allow me to use the word, is the fact that we had a cancer drugs fund which collected no data.
Absolutely.
Yes.
I mean, you know, we paid 600 million for that, and we got nothing. I mean, patients benefited undoubtedly, but we got no quantifiable data out of that. So unfortunately, it just shows us that the model is broken, I'm afraid.
I think as an industry, if we want this to really accelerate, we're going to need that level of manpower, and we have to think about how we're going to upskill talent within the academic field, and how we actually attract people into those oncology units. Because like, it's really hard to attract anybody to help out with that unit. They cannot find clinical trial nurses. They cannot find very easily.
Yeah,
And
care
unless
first.
we actually do something to upskill nurses and get them there, they're going to have that problem in the next 5 to 10 years. And the morale is going down.
What I would say on that is, you're right, there's a quantum of workforce, but there's also a productivity issue on that. If you think about where tech can help on that, you know, if I link to the national blood database, of which we've got a very good one, and national, all bloods go through one single data set in this country. Believe it or not, I'm going to get about 50% of the clinical trial exclusion criteria on an automated basis. No one's done that. Yeah, so then you know the yield on that poor nurse going around and then finding out manually that the liver function wasn't good enough, you can go away. Look at the consenting process, huge paper-based systems which no one understands and entirely designed by some crazy lawyer. Probably American. And you're just going, no, the clinicians don't understand it, the patient sure as hell doesn't understand it, and as for that poor research nurse, if she gets asked a question, we've got to start being more honest and grown up about the risks on this stuff. And again, tablet-based e-consents are a lot cheaper to administer, a lot easier for everyone to use, but they require a certain amount of simplification, and Stuart's quite right, a certain amount of increased risk appetite.
So, thank you. We are now in our final couple of minutes, and what I'd like to do is to ask each of the panel for some final thoughts. We've covered a huge area of topics, going from the fact the system needs to partly evolve through to what does this mean for society and how to create headspace for technology. So maybe if I could ask each of the panel just to give a final thought on where they think where they would like to see something move, something tangible. Maybe starting with Jackie at the end.
Yeah, I mean, I said it before. From my perspective, we need to move on data sharing. I think we need to rethink how academics get rewarded for the work that they do. There's too much protection over publication. I think that's one of the big barriers. I don't know what the answer is, but we need to find ways to do it. We need to still also protect universities' ability to leverage the data that they are producing. But this is, for me, if I could wave the magic wand, that's where I'd wave it.
Excellent. Piers?
Get the real world data we have actually doing something rather than sitting in a prison. We could do Italian-style risk shares right now on the IT systems we have. We could do observational on-market stuff right now with the IT systems we have in the NHS. Just start with what we can do.
Great. Stuart?
I'd build on that, agree with everything you say, and use it for, in parallel to piggyback as a platform for our interventional research.
Absolutely.
Because I think what that allows us to do not only is to evaluate these studies in these interventions, these innovations in real time in real patients, but also allows us to begin to get an understanding of how they compare to existing therapies. So the database becomes our clinical trial. And I think if we bring it back to our adaptability acceleration theme, that for me allows patients to benefit, us still to evaluate, and however we define approval in the new world, regulatory approval, it narrows that white space between approval and access for patients.
And then Leeza?
I guess very similar along the same lines as collaboration, but collaboration at the regulatory level as well, because I can only imagine how frustrating it is to the companies to hear one thing from the FDA, then another thing from the EMA, from the payers, from insurers, and there's no need for that. There is a lot more room for harmonization. In the end, we just want that product to work for the patient, and there's so much work that needs to be done at that level as well. And it also includes everything you just said in terms of how we use real-world evidence, how we use data sharing all in one package, how we can put it all in one package to reach decisions quicker and get products to the market faster.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you to everyone for your engagement, but especially join me in thanking the panel for a very interesting session.